So welcome everyone to Chevalier's Books Online. We are LA's oldest indie bookstore established in 1940. Tonight, we are here to discuss Rosecrans Baldwin's new book, Everything Now, Lessons from the City-State of Los Angeles. And here to interview the author, we have with us Jeff Weiss, the founder of the POW and the LA Land magazine. Jeff is also the owner of POW Reportings and a regular contributor to the Los Angeles Magazine, GQ, and the Washington Post. He is also currently working on his first book, Waiting for Britney Spears. Good luck. And with him, of course, we have our featured author, Rosecrans Baldwin. He is also the author of The Last Kids Left, You Lost Me There, In Paris, I Love You, But You're Bringing Me Down. He is a frequent contributor to GQ and co-founded the online zine, The Morning News. All right. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to our two speakers tonight, Rosecrans Baldwin and Jeff Weiss. Gentlemen, the stage is all yours.
Thank you very much, Teresa. Hi, Jeff. How's it going?
Good. How are you, Rosecrans?
I'm not bad. You look beautiful in blue this evening. I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but just it's the first thing that came to mind.
My Carolina blue dedication to Michael Jordan. Just even though it has nothing to do with it. I was going to wear a Lakers shirt, but I decided to.
James Worthy, also Carolina, also Lakers. I mean, yeah, you know, Danny Green. We can do this.
Had a little crossover
there. We can go all night.
Like, I did not sign up for basketball.
Yeah, that's right. Well, so I think I'll take the mic for a quick second. We were going to open with a little bit of reading. Does that sound right? And then get into conversation between you and me. Yeah, awesome. Okay, I'll dive in. Obviously, thank you to everyone for being here. Thank you, Chevaliers. Thank you to the Land magazine. Jeff is the co-editor-in-chief. I don't know if Jeff is going to brag on this, so I'll point it out. The Land magazine is one of the best sort of independent publications out there right now covering Los Angeles. It is a real treat if you can pick it up. And I think there's a new issue in the works, Jeff.
There is, and we'll have a Kickstarter launching in the next few weeks. You can support it because we are probably the only, I don't want to say the only, but the only one that I know of. Well, there's a few, but a DIY independent print magazine in LA, which is an increasing rarity in this kind of digital-only world. So.
Yeah. So with that shout out, I want to thank also Jeff for just being here. Jeff I'm just a great admirer of Jeff as a writer, not only as a publisher and editor too. So it's my treat to be here with Jeff and Chevaliers. So we are here. I'm going to do the obligatory plug with a visual right now. This is the green screen passing in front of my face. This is Everything Now, Lessons from the City-State of Los Angeles. I'm just going to read about 3 pages of it to sort of give a taste of what it's like. For what it's worth, this book was about 4 years in the making. I just spent a lot of time interviewing a lot of people and doing a lot of research about the history of Los Angeles and what makes Los Angeles such an interesting place to live here at the present moment. And this is just a brief interaction that I had. It lasted, I think, about 14 hours with a horse gambler. This was just, people sort of said, like, when people found out what I was doing, they said, well, at some point you have to meet this guy. And I'll just say up front 2 things. One, this character had to be given a pseudonym due to some activities that he's involved in. So I will explain that in the reading, but it is not his real name. And second, there are moments in this passage that go kind of blue, you might say. I will do my best to sort of, given I'm not sure who's listening right now, to change that up. But if there is a slip, I ask for your forgiveness ahead of time. So excuse me. Writing a book such as this, about the city-state of Los Angeles and its humans and their wins and losses, eventually a person would be introduced to Henry Chinaski. And what Chinaski had managed to do by his mid-40s, and only in the city-state of Los Angeles could he have achieved it, he believed, was to construct a life in which he made just enough money as an actor and lost just enough money as a gambler to be able to do exactly what he liked. And what he often liked to do, 7 days a week, was to go on a 14-hour marathon, 10 a.m. until 2 in the morning, during which he'd run the bars in his little corner of the San Fernando Valley and play the ponies. By noon on a bright autumn Thursday, Chinaski had been gambling and drinking for about 90 minutes in a dark bar in North Hollywood, the small valley town that was about a 15-minute drive over the mountains from Hollywood proper. Chinaski had lived in the county for nearly 2 decades. In person, he had the broad-shouldered good looks of a former football player whom the universe had yet to strike with much grief. For 15 years, he'd been a horseman, he said when we shook hands, and had gained something he called the horseman's mentality, which he promised to explain over the course of the day. Horses are my kryptonite, he said while ordering us a pair of beers. I walk by a TV with a horse on it, I get the sweats. A race was about to start. Just a side note quickly, when I recounted this next section for the audiobook, I think I might have permanently damaged my audiobook engineer's ears. Chinaski, when he is watching a race, can get quite excitable, and I did probably mistakenly an impression for the audiobook. So I'm going to tone it down now, but just imagine this ratcheting up to much greater volume. I'm not sure if Zoom can handle it. A race was about to start. Chinaski picked up a newspaper and rolled it into a crop. It was his habit during races to whack the bar like a jockey stoking his horse to a win. So here's the two horse, Chinaski narrated quietly after the gun went off. He's on the lead. That's where you want this horse to be. You see, he's getting a little heat on the outside. And whack went the crop. Now, we need this two horse to get out. Watch the jockey look under his right armpit. Then we know he's got horse. He's about to blast out. Whack, whack went the crop, and his voice picked up volume. Now, come on, buddy, just look. Don't let this four go with you. Come out on the four, whip him on the left-hand side, come out on the four, and whack, whack, whack. Four's already all in. Jesus, we're handwriting. We might be loaded. This four horse could be loaded. Oh, man, I need a wire. Whack, 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 whack. And here comes the three on the inside. 2-3, get the exacted, but do not let the three win. Oh, son of a gun, don't do it to me. Stay up there, 4. Give me 2-3-4, and Rosecrans is a 4-leaf clover. Whack, 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 whack. 2's a winner. 3's coming in second. 2-3-4, 6. Oh, my God, we did it. We hit the superfecta and everything. And just whack, 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 whack. I apologize if I blew out the Zoom. I had no idea what had happened, except the beers were empty, the crop was in tatters, and Chinaski was very glad to meet me, he said, while he ordered us another round. Remy Nadeau, writing in Los Angeles from Mission to Modern City, said, Los Angeles is perennially refreshing itself with newcomers who have left behind them the pressures for conformity. The Chinaskis of Pittsburgh were a large, sturdy family of Catholic Czech Americans, Chinaski said, with roots somewhere outside of Prague. Chinaski, the youngest of 6, much younger than the rest, had grown up babysitting his sister's children. A gambler since he was 13, a lifelong performer, he'd always dreamed big, but no one had encouraged his ambitions. No one thought he'd leave Pittsburgh, but they hadn't made room for him either. Anybody who's a little too loud, who doesn't want to give in, they reject you, he said. So he moved to Los Angeles and found a place that had room for him. Still, a sense of being spurned pissed him off. In Pittsburgh, you do anything out of the ordinary, you're viewed as weird. And if you get a little success, they root against you. And when you are successful, they love you a lot. That's not exactly what he said. I hate it. I want everybody to win. Whatever you're into, I'm into it. Gradually, Chinaski had found his way into acting, small parts in television and film, some national commercials. Around the bars and restaurants of the San Fernando Valley, specifically North Hollywood, where Chinaski lived and mostly stayed. He was known well enough to be greeted cheerfully by the dozen or so bartenders and hostesses we encountered. He knew their names, the names of the men on the valet, the number of children in a line cook's family. Oh, here we go, said one bartender loudly, an aspiring actress in her early 20s, who turned around as soon as she saw him and switched the television to the races. No one here ever watches horses, she said. We do love him. For an hour, Chinaski placed small bets, cups of coffee, on several races, and he lost all of them, but that was routine, he said. As a working gambler, the most he'd ever won on a single bet was $64,000. The most in a single weekend in Las Vegas, $100,000. The most on the Kentucky Derby, $37,000. But mostly he lost, he said, smiling, then turned to the bartender and asked after her latest auditions. All day and night, Chinaski was solicitous and generous, always picking up tabs, happy-go-unlucky with strangers and friends. It made me think that probably the only thing better than being Chinaski, in Chinaski's mind, would to be a more winning Chinaski, a version ridden as fast and as far as a Chinaski's pumping heart could take him. The biggest gamble of his life, he explained between races, was his acting career. He still had a dream to land something meaty, a regular role on a show, just some great lines and a great scene. In the meantime, he couldn't complain. People were like, you could have contributed to the world, he said. I couldn't. I'm limited. If I could be Elon Musk, I'd be Elon Musk. All I can do is be charming and open doors and get groceries for people, take people to the doctor. I'm good and I'm nice, but it's not at a life-changing level. I just know my limits. Suddenly, a gun fired. Another race. He'd already placed his bets. He stood up and yanked out his crop. Oh, we got horse. We got horse. Come on, 5. We got horse. Come out on the 6. Come out on the 6. You're going to gun me down, 6. 6, get us done. Shit. The 6 is like Falcor from the never-ending story. The race ended. Another loss. Chinaski yelled again and sat down angrily on his stool. I asked how much he'd lost. He didn't answer, just drank his beer. That was a big, big bomber, he said quietly to himself. A moment later, he said from the corner of his mouth, what is the second best thing to gambling and winning? Gambling and losing. I asked if that was the horseman's mentality. He didn't answer. A few minutes later, Chinaski checked his phone. Holy crap, he said quietly. He stood up. Holy crap! What is it? The bartender said. Chinaski looked at her. He looked at his phone again, then stared out the door. His body went rigid. His eyes were suddenly glowing as if the sun was in the center of his skull. I can't believe it, he whispered. What? I booked a part. You did? I booked a part. The bartender laughed. There you go, Chinaski. He read out an email to the entire bar. It was from his television agent. He booked a gig the following week, a speaking role on a new police show. It's 2 lines or whatever, he said, but just get me on set. Who knows what's going to happen? You're a charmer, the bartender reassured him. You're charming. If I crush 1 or 2 lines and somebody might think, instead of casting Buffalo Bill or whatever, put in Chinaski. You got to believe that. Tough up or buck up, Chinaski, the bartender said, laughing, and put down 2 more beers. Thank you very much.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm going to buy the audiobook even though I don't buy audiobooks.
I'll sign it for you.
Did you come to LA to be an actor?
Yeah, big no on that one.
Yeah, no, but you got a good theatrical stuff. I appreciate it. Well, one of the things I admired most about your book was writing about LA is obviously an impossible challenge, just for an insider or an outsider. And I think people are really. It's interesting. I mean, I don't think a city's ever been more written about more poorly. But conversely, at the same time, even for people from LA, my mom didn't know how to get from one side of town to the other for like her entire life. She grew up in the valley. So it's and I think one of the things that I really admired most about your book is you kind of were able to capture there's like the throngs of people and the different identities and everything. And usually I think people in LA focus on, when people write about LA, they pick 1 or 2 things. But I think the notion of it as a city-state, which is kind of the all-encompassing kind of theme that kind of stretches through your book, is a really appropriate one because LA really is, to me, a nation in and of itself. I mean, in a way that, it feels, connected by freeways and just all these different people. And, you kind of kept all these different ideas inside your head at the same time and were able to dissect it really elegantly and with a lot of grace and wit. And so I commend it.
Wow, thank you. I was like, is there a question mark? Otherwise, this is
no question. I'm just broke. I was going to start out in terms of the question. This is obviously something you've discussed elsewhere, but for the people reading it, or watching this who might not know, tell me a little bit about what brought you to LA and what made you want to come here in the first place.
Yeah. Very simple and probably a very cliche story. My wife, my partner and I, Rachel, both of us are writers, and we'd had an idea for a TV show. It got a little traction out here. A studio got involved. It was enormous, and then it all fell apart, which I think is how 99% of things go in Hollywood.
That's the defining LA experience.
Yeah, there we go. Or at least one of them. But we sort of realized there was a tradition in Hollywood of husband and wife screenwriting teams. And at the time, we were living on the outskirts of Chapel Hill, North Carolina. We'd eaten every single thing in every single restaurant. We were ready for a change. We'd lived in big cities before. Yeah, and so we just, sold our little house and came out here and found an apartment. And then I think the weird things that happened, and like I said, I think you and I have actually talked about this before, but I had 2 very strange experiences. One very common, I think, and one kind of odd. The common one being I came here and just was really confounded, like your mother, perhaps. I'm not from here. Obviously, I don't have any, besides an ancestor of mine, I don't have any connections to LA. And I'd come once as a kid to go to Disneyland. But this is 6 years ago. And I felt at home, super genuine, sincere. There's nothing facetious about this. I honestly felt, in a way, having lived in multiple cities, multiple towns, here something clicked for me immediately. And then the second, like I was saying, was that confoundingness. How are these neighborhoods part of the same place but so different? How does the city seemed to just unfurl no matter in what direction you go for however long you go. Why can you be driving down the 101 in traffic and yet you unroll the window and it smells like flowers? There's like just these sort of things that just didn't make any sense to me. So right away, it was both I was in love with the place and I was really, my head was spinning.
Yeah. I also should mention the one ancestor. I mean, you do probably have the greatest LA name. It's like a made up LA name. It's like a Thomas Pynchon version of an LA name. Where you're like, Rosecrans Baldwin. You're like, I see it in Cleveland.
Someone was making fun of me on Twitter, saying that it had to be a pen name, but it was the worst pen name because who would choose a pen name just composed of Los Angeles property areas? Like here's a big street and here's Baldwin Hills and let's mash them together. It's stupid.
It's also could be a good rapper name. Like
a lot of West Coast rap, Rosecrans is right there.
Yeah, Rosecrans Ave, and my friend Vic runs one of the best West Coast blogs. And obviously Rosecrans. I mean, Randall Roberts actually wrote a really good piece in the LA Times about kind of Rosecrans Ave as one of the main arteries that connects Los Angeles. Yeah. And your ancestor was the Rosecrans, right? That it was named after.
Yeah, he was a Union general in the Civil War, and afterwards, I think he and Lincoln were pretty pissed at each other, and he came out here and bought some land near San Pedro, and later became a congressman, which is how things got named after him. And there's some. If my dad is listening to this right now, Dad, email me later so I can have accurate information as to how many greats are involved. But yeah. It was a last name in our family, and then it became a first name.
Yeah, I mean, I feel that's like an unprecedented street cred. So even though you're technically a transplant, that's like way more than anything, right? You're like, actually, my family was here in the 1860s, so
yeah,
Yeah.
All
right, so I guess my next question would be, obviously your head's spinning. How are your perceptions different of LA from what you'd expected or what you heard the stereotypes were like?
That's funny. That's a really good question, and it's not. No one's asked me that. First of all, there's so many cliches about LA, and some obviously about like all cliches hang true. Yeah. But if your gloss on Los Angeles was to just read East Coast media, or just to, frankly, to consume the films, and Los Angeles Plays Itself covers this really well, if anyone who hasn't seen it, it's just a wonderful film about how Los Angeles is portrayed in media and cinema specifically, but also television. But you would have such a tiny, narrow idea about Los Angeles, and it wouldn't be necessarily complimentary. And then Los Angeles is often held up, I think, as a model for here's our statue and let's wrap a news headline around it without actually looking at the statue too closely. So Los Angeles is representative of urban strife having to do with what happened to Rodney King, or it's representative of natural disasters because of the threat of earthquakes, or it is going back to what happened in Watts. There's all these periods of time where Los Angeles is the story, but it's not really read too closely by the rest of the country, was kind of my impression. Again, I'm speaking in generals because we're just having a conversation on Zoom in this weird world. But I knew I didn't know much. And that's why way before I even thought about writing Los Angeles, just getting here and talking to people and just, I guess, being a curious person, I just started reading the heck out of Los Angeles, and that's, I had already read Mike Davis before I got here. I'd already read some Octavia Butler, but, discovering people like Carrie McWilliams, Linnell George, just diving into both sort of recent contemporary writing about Los Angeles and then also more historical stuff. William Deverell, there's lots of great compilations, the David Ulin book, like it opened doors because I was just wanting to know more about it. So like the cliches that I had, I don't know, man, they got the doors blown off very fast because once you're living here as compared to visiting here, Los Angeles is a very different animal, and it's a very different experience. I mean, you're from here, I don't know if you have that, I guess, almost like an outsider's perspective at all on it. Does it feel that way? I mean, as someone who lives here? Okay.
This is like the only city I've ever lived in, so I have no understanding of it. Like, people will be like, "You sound so LA," and I'm like, "I don't know what you're talking about." Like, and I'm like, "What are you talking about?" I'm like, "You have an LA drawl," and I'm like, "Yeah." I'm such a townie, I think, about the city, but I was gonna say, what were the things that were so different for you from when you were visiting versus when you lived here? Because I assume you visited here a bunch of times, over the course of
Yeah,
your life.
I mean, literally just twice. No, excuse me, 3 times. Once as a kid, Disneyland. Second, my wife and I did a wonderful drive. You start up in Santa Cruz and just cruise down on, I guess it's the PCH there, along the cliffs and come down here. And all we were meant to do was fly out of LAX, and our flight got canceled. And a friend of my wife's, Amina, if you're listening, thank you for this. She just sort of took us in for the night and the day, and we sort of got to see her Los Angeles, and I think that's what can make such a difference. So
I totally agree.
the anecdote I would say is that before 2 cities ago, we lived in France for 2 years. We lived in Paris, France. And Paris, when you have the tourist experience of Paris, that is certainly one thing. And it can be individual, it can be yours, and you can find ways to enjoy the cafe culture and museums and whatever. But when you begin to become friends with, or people, acquaintances with people that live there, that know the city, that they open the doors to the outside of the building, and suddenly you discover the courtyard and the dinner parties, and you get inside of it, it's a really different place. And as soon as we got here, that began to happen. And like I was saying, the lived experience of Los Angeles, it's just, if you, as a tourist, you might be pointed to, I don't know, something stupid, the Hollywood Walk of Fame, or you're going to go like, oh, let's go to Venice and look at the boardwalk, or let's go downtown and just see the most sort of obvious spots.
Go to the last bookstore and take an Instagram.
No, listen,
It's a good bookstore.
It is a good bookstore. Buy some books.
It's no Chevaliers or anything.
No, it's no Chevaliers.
Yeah.
But Chevaliers, I'm sure, is also a nice Instagram background. I mean, no knocking the Chevaliers' social media presence.
Totally.
But no, living here, then you start to discover like, oh, there's other places to be. There's reasons to go up to Chatsworth or down to Leimert Park or down to Long Beach or out to Point Mugu. Like, in other words, like suddenly the whole place opens up, and that's just the tip of all of the vastness and the diversity and all the richness of LA.
Yeah, I've always said LA to me is sort of like, remember like Scooby-Doo, where like they'd pull the candelabra and then the wall would rotate around. And you're like, what the fuck? What, can I curse? Are we allowed? What the hell is going on? I don't know.
What the heck is happening?
Yeah, I don't know. Am I Henry Miller getting thrown out for obscenity? I don't know. Yeah, but then you pull it. And actually, the most valuable experience for me was, I lived here my whole life, and it was when I was a columnist at the local all weekly that we shall not speak its name, that no longer exists, R.I.P. But yeah. Driving around I had a column called Bizarre Ride, and it was so great because I'd just be like, yeah, like I'm gonna go to like random places every week, and like I would, whether it's like you're in a backyard in Inglewood or you're going to LA County Jail, or whether you're interviewing somebody in Highland Park or like Topanga Canyon, and all types of musicians and artists and chefs and anything that can do with music. But it is so vast and so sprawling. And you mentioned Long Beach, right? Like, I mean, Long Beach is its own world unto itself, and it's like,
right.
I mean, it's not LA, but it's sort of like, it's close, like first cousin, sort of.
I mean, I think I'll go a little bit further with one point I made, which is that the idea that Los Angeles might have something in common with Parisian cafe culture might not be the most obvious thing to say about Los Angeles. In the same way that people think, or people say, that Los Angeles is a bad walking city. And as someone who goes to cities and loves to walk around, I completely disagree. But in the book, I interviewed a guy named James Rojas, city planner, grew up in East LA, went to MIT, was in the Army, was in Europe. And he made the argument to me, but this is also his work, and he's built an enormous amount of study and work around it, around a sort of a Latino sort of aestheticism, that Paris and particularly Latinx neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods in LA share something in common, which is to say that Los Angeles doesn't have perhaps the coziness of other American cities. That if you're walking around Manhattan or San Francisco, there is just, because the limestone is so old, because the patina has been acquired over so much time, and also the bedrock is so firm, that those places seem to have sort of, I don't know, a built-in fineness to them. Or there's spots in Minneapolis or Boston that just have a warmth to the brownstone and to the sort of the lived environment. And LA here is billboards and concrete and barbed wire fences and highways. And obviously, yes, bougainvillea and gorgeous, flowers. But he was saying that LA may not have the coziness of other cities, but there is a certain civic value in people being on the street. Again, his point saying more likely to be in East LA or Boyle Heights than in Beverly Hills or in Bel Air, that people are enjoying themselves out in public. That if you take the idea of the plaza from Central or South America or Mexico, where people are out and about and you're overhearing some gossip and you're running into an old friend or there's some family and you're on the front porch rather than the back porch. You're out in the front yard, not the backyard. You're having a cookout in the driveway. That there is a sense of that Parisian cafe culture where there's so much value to be had with people bumping into each other and seeing the sparks fly. And he was like, that's an obvious connection for me. And I had never thought of it that way. But as soon as he said that, that was going back to my experiences in Paris, being like, yeah, I actually see that more in LA than other American cities where people are locking themselves up in the backyard and not running into their neighbors so much.
Yeah, no, I definitely think there's like some validity to it. And I think one of the problems with much of the writing about LA historically, from not necessarily the books that you mentioned, obviously, but more from the outsiders, is this kind of, it's a very typical white focus with Hollywood being kind of the epicenter of everything. And that completely discounts, like, I don't know, let's say swap meet culture in South LA, or, you know, night markets in the San Gabriel Valley, or, you know, even along Vermont, you know, every Saturday, you know, it's just, you know, it's just south of Wilshire, but it's like a strip, and it's mostly, you know, Latino owned businesses, and it's, you know, brimming with life. And, you know, and then obviously there are the farmers markets that, you know, have proliferated, but there is that culture. But again, it is really something where it's like, you have to find it. You have to kind of, LA doesn't like, you have to find LA. LA won't necessarily find you. And I think a lot of people are looking for, you know, it's sort of like one of those things, like a cat versus a dog. You know, a dog just like you know, the dogs just run up to you, and cats are like, see how it is. And LA looks like a.
I think that's true.
Yeah,
I think that's true, and I think that's the great thing about Los Angeles is that it is a common complaint that I heard occasionally. So another aspect of the book is I wrote quite a bit about loneliness in Los Angeles. And one facet of that is I went on Craigslist every month for about a year and a half. And I just posted an ad saying, hey, does anyone want to talk about loneliness? I'm writing a book about Los Angeles. I'd be interested in your thoughts. By the way, if you respond to this, you may get quoted in the book. But again, I'm a writer doing a book about Los Angeles. Okay, so apparently no one on Craigslist reads the finer copy, because I mostly got solicitations for sexual, partners and friendships. And the solicitations often were quite persistent. You know, you would sort of say, no, I'm writing a book about Los Angeles. I'm trying about loneliness. And they're like, well, can you send me some pics first? And I'm like, I don't think that's standard journalism practice in most of my work, but maybe. In any case, but people did engage on the subject. And I would just hear from people. We had these long conversations. And the reason I'm going to this is that often I heard a complaint that Los Angeles not only can be a lonely city. I mean, something like 30% of residents of Los Angeles live by themselves. And that, not for everybody, is a bad thing. It can be quite a good thing. But there was the idea that Los Angeles is disappointing if you don't make much of an effort. If you aren't willing to put yourself out there, if you aren't willing to be a little bit vulnerable and sort of extend and go discover something, then you're not going to get much in return. And I think that the way that Los Angeles is organized, it is quite easy to stay in your neighborhood or in your town. And some people would talk to me about the transactional value of relationships in Los Angeles. The idea that, for example, just in driving, Jeff, I think you and I live relatively close to one another, but if you lived in Pasadena and I lived in, I don't know, in Ventura, I understand some people are instantly going to jump in the chat and be like, Ventura's not part of Los Angeles. And I hear you. But my point is, let's say I'm in, I don't know, Malibu, and you're in Pasadena. We are going to subconsciously decide if the other person is valuable enough to visit, just to warrant what could be an hour and a half drive in the worst of conditions. And that transactional nature, which can extend to everything, to business or to friendship or to intimacy or to whatever, it can just be a part of the connection with other people in a way that doesn't seem as pronounced in other places. And I think they're not wrong. I think that can be quite true. And the way that status here can sometimes be very obvious the way that people use certain things to signify to others in their community, like, hey, I value, I matter. And maybe for me, it's my BMW. Maybe for me, it's my hot boyfriend. Maybe for me, it is showing you that I have 6 billion Instagram followers, whatever it is. It can be kind of disappointing if you are not someone who has those things that would appear to matter to you and your people.
I was going to ask you, what was the weirdest thing you found in your reporting?
Good question.
There's a lot of weird things that you found.
I'm right now covering up the fact that I have to think about this. So cue the hold music. Okay, weird things. I mean, some things, not everything. So I did a lot of reporting and research that didn't end up in the book for whatever reason. Some of the weirder things. Listen, it is unusual to enjoy drinking human blood or having your human blood drank. So by virtue of a couple layers of invitations, I was able to meet some people who identify as real vampires. They would put the real before the vampire and also capitalize the R, which they were really like conspicuous about their attention to fine grammar, which I found really endearing.
It's amazing they don't have a reality show.
So I had to agree to. They have been approached many times from reality television producers and been like, we like our letters capitalized. You are not going to pay attention to things that matter to us.
Yeah.
In any case, so they would be identified as real vampires because they would identify vampires as just people who enjoy the lifestyle. For example, someone who enjoys watching True Blood on HBO, or perhaps just thinks Halloween is the better holiday than Thanksgiving. Whereas a real vampire enjoys both having their plasma consumed or consuming the plasma of others. And they were making the case that Los Angeles probably has the second highest density. By Los Angeles, I really mean greater Los Angeles. So the full 5 counties. And in their case, they do meetups that include people coming down from Las Vegas, but it has the second highest density of real vampires next to Louisiana. I don't know if the statistics are all that are going to hold up under scrutiny, but it was just an interesting time because they agreed I could come meet a couple of them. They were they were meeting for happy hour at a place in I think it was in Burbank, and I couldn't. So I make the joke in the book, like, vampires, they look like everybody else, and it's true. Like the lead real vampire that I was meeting is a nurse practitioner. So they agreed I couldn't find them.
That strikes me as a real vampire job, though. Not to. Right? It's a good place to get blood.
I mean, good expertise, but that's the thing is that the bloodletting required a certain amount. This was quite touching. I actually thought a certain amount of intimacy between the donor and the receiver, and it often then led to a romantic relationship. And in fact, one of the sort of donors I was talking to, he made a joke about how they like to play with their food. And anyway, so that there's some things that are weird on the face of it because it's not often that one runs into a real vampire. But I think the weirdest things that I ran into that weren't sort of obvious, I want to say people that are really, they're doing a lot for the city and not doing it. I think there are a lot of people. So this is something I've always found weird. And I was talking about this with someone today in a conversation it was her idea, and it sort of really links something up in my mind, that there can be an inkling among Angelenos, by which I mean people from here, not me, but people that I interviewed who just were a little bit reluctant to say that they liked living in LA, but they really did like living in LA. And I found that a little bit odd that it's not about pride. It was more about, it just didn't seem to be something that they were looking to express necessarily in the way that in New York, there can be this very pronounced super pride about being a New Yorker. And I hate doing the LA, New York duality. I'm not doing that. But in LA, obviously, there's pride in certain things, whether you're a Dodger fan or a Lakers fan, or just really love the city for one aspect. There's just not a sense of necessarily having to broadcast it, whether you are participating in the city life or you just love the city. And I thought that was just a phenomenon, because I think there certainly is an enormous amount of pride here in the city, but because the city is so bifurcated, because the idea of LA is so vast, that it may be that idea of pleasure and enjoyment or pride can be quite localized rather than identified with the entire mass of LA.
I was gonna say, what's surprised?
A song about it, but
yeah.
Also
Tupac, a little man named Tupac, which
little man.
Which is probably, there aren't that many LA kind of jingoistic anthems as much as say New York or something. You know, there's not
Right.
like there's no like Frank Sinatra. I mean, I guess even like the Randy Newman song's a little tongue in cheek. You know.
Yeah, it's
Uh,
very tongue in cheek.
yeah. I mean, the Tupac one is sincere, but Tupac wasn't even from LA. So I mean, really, that's ultimately the transplant anthem. I mean,
I mean, LAX does have its own theme song, which, as far as I could find, was the only airport internationally that has its own song. And it's a bit of a banger. Yeah.
Who made it? Like Steely Dan?
Oh no, I'm sorry. Shoot, now I have to go to the book because I don't want to get her name wrong. Hold on. I actually might be able to turn to this page on the spot because I know what chapter it's in. Can you fill in the dead air by asking me a question that takes a while to ask?
All right. Should I just start rapping the lyrics to Live and Die in LA? Yeah, you know.
That would be extraordinary if you did that.
I can't wait for that to be on video. So what surprised you the most about your trials and travails through Los Angeles? You know, and I guess in that really respect, I'm thinking, what exactly, you know, did you set out to kind of prove and didn't come to fruition, or vice versa? You know, that something was kind of, I did not see that coming, and now I have this thought about the city.
I think I'm now literally, this is how bad I am on Zoom, but I'm trying to Google this. Whatever. Okay, I'll figure it out later. And it's in the book.
It's in the chat. It's Leanne Scott wrote the LAX song.
Thank you, chat person.
And Jenny Killard. Shout out Jenny.
Shout out Jenny.
Yeah.
So in terms of surprises, well, I mean, this is a hard question to answer a little bit. One thing that became a surprise was when I started working on the book, I never intended to be in it. That was just, it wasn't meant to be, it's not a memoir. I didn't see myself turning up, but I didn't feel like I had the expertise or the legitimacy in certain ways. But then what was surprising about it got quite personal. And that was everything, I think, because I set out, here's, you know, the idea of Los Angeles being a city-state. One thing, I know the book is marketed in a certain way, and I think that is to create buzz and certain things, but I didn't set out to tell Los Angeles what Los Angeles is. Like, sounds like a nightmare, and I would not want to walk into that trap and not have the authority or even the ideas to do it. So silly. But with the idea of the city-state is more that in my own experience living here, again, only like 6.5 years or something, is it helped me understand LA better, right? And for whatever reason, I needed that and I wanted that, and it sort of helped me. It helped me dig in further, like, and just enjoy LA more by thinking about it this way. And so that's where the book came from. But if the book structurally sets out to sort of make that argument, and then kind of, I think about 2/3 of the way through the book, kind of gives up the ghost. It's sort of saying, I do believe that Los Angeles makes sense as a city-state. Don't get me wrong. I'm backing my book in that argument. But about 2/3 of the way through, the certain themes, each chapter is organized around a theme of what life can be like in Los Angeles at the current moment. And the idea of inequality just was hammered through so strenuously in so many stories that I couldn't help but feel myself, I guess, involved in it, just because, you know, I was interviewing dozens of people and driving all over the place, and just to see the inequality of Los Angeles so up front, that it actually did reinforce this idea that Los Angeles sometimes can feel like a medieval city-state updated, whether it is the aesthetics of the fortresses versus the flatlands, or the income inequality, or I can go on. There's a whole book about it. But also like the experience of being here. That was a surprise. I didn't expect to get its hooks in me in that way. So in the end, someone was talking to me the other day and they're like, "You're really emotional in this book." And I think it was like a good thing and also a bad thing. I don't know, but it was a good thing for me. I was like, well, yeah, I sort of got led there. You know, that's sort of the only way this book was going to work out for me.
I was going to say, you know, not to get you dragged online for not being a jingoistic booster that people would like, but what do you feel the city, oh yeah, what do you think, what do you hate about it? Now, what do you think the city most lacks? Like, what, you know, is the thing that, you know, you miss about, you know, that you miss about like other cities versus LA that you think it kind of doesn't do as well?
I don't know, man. This is, are you sandbagging me right now?
Yeah.
I feel like the
Yeah.
trap feels very
Yeah.
obvious.
This whole time, I faked our friendship. But
There might be a trap beneath the trap.
Yeah. You don't have to answer. We can go on to another. What do you?
No. I'm happy. This is a good question. I don't mean to be too much of a jerk. Just a small amount of a jerk.
I can want to say about this. Yeah.
I don't think. I think the book. I make the point. I quote Steve Lopez at one point, the Los Angeles Times columnist, and him saying that Los Angeles is in greater need of critics than defenders. And I also make a somewhat silly point saying that I and this book never set out to wear a Dodgers cap like in the writing of this book. I'm not here to. Los Angeles doesn't lack for boosters and never has through all of its phases of development. And there are people who are elected to do that job, it would appear. For me, what Los Angeles lacks occasionally is a sense that it doesn't need to go where it's going, which is to say that, like, yes, it's vast, it's unruly. The powers that be are divided between this crazy system of supervisors to billionaires who can just take over a section of downtown and start building buildings. And granted, some of them are quite beautiful, to other billionaires who can just show up in Hawthorne and be like, I think we should start digging. And someone's looking at him and be like, you want to dig a what? And he's like, no, we're just going to start digging and then we're going to bury some Teslas down there. I mean, I guess if that's going to bring us money. So the idea that Los Angeles, a magnificent aspect of the civic life of Los Angeles is that it's quite changeable and it's changing all the time. And a lot of people can play a role. The downside to that is that it can be easy to accept that Los Angeles is going to unfurl as it unfurls, and homelessness is just going to be there forever. And the disappearance of the middle class and is always going to be there forever. And this new normal is something that we just have to accept rather than change. And I think that sort of doom brain mentality, and it's just sort of like, I'm going to look the other way and go back to my apartment or my house and not participate. That is an aspect of living here. Now, granted, sure, I'm sure it's an aspect of living in Miami or Houston or Seattle also, but it's in a place this big and this important, it is not necessarily our best trait.
That's a great answer. You could have also said adequate mass transit. You know,
housing. We can go on.
Totally.
Adequate mass transit.
Adequate mass transit. Yeah, no, I was like, I was in the bag. I was like, pretty good mass transit here. Like, not as good as it thinks it has, but pretty good mass transit. What do you feel is, I mean, you kind of, I guess, have covered this, but I know we only have a few minutes left, so I was going to ask two more questions. What do you feel is the city's greatest strength? Let me add to that, maybe its greatest strength that might be a little more subtle, that isn't like a transparently obvious great strength of LA.
Okay. So great strength, but not transparently obvious great strength. And then, Jeff, I just looked at my watch for the first time, which is to say the clock on a computer, and we have 15 minutes left. So maybe we jump to reader or viewer questions after this.
Yeah, I think, is it now?
Or we're waiting for Teresa to pop back in. So never mind. Let's do this. Let's do this question. Yeah. Greatest, most non-obvious strength of Los Angeles. Listen, I'll do the obvious one, then the non-obvious one. The obvious one is the diversity. Los Angeles is the most diverse place that I've ever experienced. I'm not going to, please don't quote me on numbers right now, but just the sheer variety of peoples here from around the world is extraordinary, and it is actually an asset in a way that I feel is actually quite valued by Angelenos, in a way that sometimes in the rest of the United States can just be sort of a token acknowledgement of our history rather than a asset to life today. The best non-obvious aspect is something that I think a lot of people disagree with me on, but I honestly think that there is a sense of benevolence among Angelenos. Kit Rackless, magazine editor, made the point to me, and I quote him in the book, that it is not common that this many people from this many walks of life can live on top of each other and more or less get along peacefully. If you consider that we have 11 million people in the county, 20 million people in greater LA, the amount of strife we have just statistically is mind-bogglingly small. And I don't know about you, and I'm not talking about woo-woo, I'm not talking about hippy-dippy, I'm talking about I have discovered a general sort of aura of niceness and politeness among people. And I'm talking, I'm driving out to Azusa, I'm in Compton, I'm in Downey, I mean, not Downey, excuse me, I was thinking of somewhere else that's over near Santa Clarita. It doesn't matter. I just kept running into it, and it was nice. So
it's not
maybe
another
people-
Midwest, but it's better than I think people. It's better than New York. You know, so I'll say with that. You know, you go to the Midwest and you're like, why is everyone waving? You're like,
yeah, but it's not the same. There's there's talk behind the hand at the same time.
yeah. All right. My last question before we go into the Q&A round is an impossibly broad one, so feel free to answer it however you see fit. But, you know, what do you know, the $1 million question, of course, always, what do you see as the future of LA? And let's just say, you know, the immediate 5 to 10 years. I'm not asking you to be like Blade Runner with it, you know. Although Blade Runner's now, so technically.
What is the future of Los Angeles? The future of Los Angeles is hopeful. I think that honestly, I think it's a hopeful future. I think we are in some very dismal times. I think our problems are enormous. At the same time, I think there's a lot of people trying to fix them. So I have hope for it. At the same time, I live in Hollywood. You know, I have an encampment of people who are unhoused right down the corner, and I see people shooting up on the street. It's a nightmare. You read the paper, you see how many people that are living hand to mouth. There's one story after another about the sort of doomy side of things, but the thing about LA is that everything's on the surface, right? Like you don't have to go anywhere to be able to see life in LA. And part of me hopes, because I just run into people who are doing the good work to try and make life better for people, that would put us actually in a position to perhaps make things better, because it's very hard to hide stuff in LA other than billions of dollars of investments, which are hidden.
It's hard to hide it unless it's a bunch of money stuffed into an envelope and given to a city council person.
No, I didn't say it. I didn't say it.
I will say anything. That's my problem. All right, are we ready for the Q&A?
Yeah, I think we are. So as I mentioned, we're getting into audience Q&A now. So if you haven't typed up your question into the chat box, you can go ahead and do it now, and we will get to them soon. We've got 2 so far. The first one is from Sam, who's asking, what is the hardest part of doing a profile of someone? I'm sure it must be hard to condense the essence of a person into just a few pages.
Well, that's a great question, Sam. Thank you. The hardest part I find, I'll buy some time here. One of the things, there's quite a few profiles in the book, but I also make a living often writing profiles for GQ magazine and a couple other places. To be honest, the hardest part is in the moment not screwing it up, because you get such a limited amount of time with a person. Inevitably, especially if they are a famous person, like the kind of people that I profile for GQ, you're often only given an hour or 2 or 3 hours, and you have to make a genuine connection with them. And it can be quite difficult because you're trying to bring to life things that people haven't seen, and that requires, like any of us, if you meet a stranger at a party, you're inevitably going to talk about the weather or work before you know what happened to your sister when you were a kid growing up. Nothing happened to my sister, by the way, in case my sister's watching this. That was a weird thing. So what's difficult about it is finding the connection, and that's what, with this book, I got really lucky because no one really believes that people write books at a certain level. You can be like, hey, I'd love to interview you, I'm working on a book, and they're like, well, okay, like that's never going to happen. So people were just extraordinarily generous and gracious with their time, and I got to just keep asking questions over and over. And if you read people, there's one of the great, sort of nonfiction writers of our time is John McPhee. And, McPhee and, forgive me, Robert, who is the person who wrote the wonderful books about Lyndon Johnson? I'm going to blank on the name, forgive me.
Caro?
Yeah, Robert Caro. So actually, let me go away from McPhee to Caro. Caro made a point one time, he was interviewing, I want to say Johnson's brother, but to try and get people to conjure up what an experience looked like for them in the moment, our memories harden so fast, and we tell ourselves stories, and those stories become firm in our minds. But when you get an opportunity, when someone comes along and starts asking you questions about those memories, and you start to see things fresh, there's a privileged position between you as sort of the subject and also the interviewer at that time. It can become intimate really fast because you're bound up in this experience of discovering something that you thought you knew and they don't know anything about. And so it's sort of virgin territory for both of you. So that is not an answer at all to a question about what's difficult about writing profiles. If anything, that's like the best part. The best part is you, for an instant, get to know someone really well. And in the case of this book, luckily, some of them still answer my text messages versus Roger Federer. Roger Federer has never talked to me again, but nice guy.
That's good to know. We've got a question from Max Bell who says, I imagine you've read a fair amount of fiction set in Los Angeles. 2 questions. Which book do you think best encapsulates the feeling of living here? Second question, which one is your favorite?
Man, was this person's name is Max? Is that right?
Max, yes.
Great writer
okay.
for The Land, among other places.
Okay. I think there's going to be an email later about, I'm like, wait a second, that Max? Max, thank you for the question. Good question. I feel super on the spot. So now I have to think about this for a second. Look, I think one of the unrecognized books about Los Angeles and what it's like to live here is The Sellout by Paul Beatty. It won the Booker Prize. A lot of people hold it up as a great piece of satire. Personally, I didn't laugh once reading that book. I thought that was just, it may be absurd, it may be surreal, but it, to me, just often rang true in ways that could read as exaggerated, but often felt like, wow, this is a little bit of day-to-day life sometimes, interactions between people. In terms of what gets LA best, I mean, there's so many great books that get slices of LA just right that I wouldn't even dare go there. I will say a book that I loved that I read when I was doing research for this book was by Hector Tobar. And Hector, if you're listening, I'm so sorry if I get this wrong, but I want to say it's The Barbarian Nurseries or I'll Google this later. If anyone's interested in this book, email me. It's rosecrans@gmail. I will send you the title. But there's a Hector Tobar book set in Orange County called, has the words barbarians in it. And I feel awful not remembering this. But that's a wonderful book about sort of just a very defining part of LA.
All right, so we've got a couple questions that were emailed into us a little bit before the event, so I'll get to those. And the first one is, did you ever feel an extreme pressure while writing this book? And do you think you still have it in you to write about Los Angeles now that this book is out?
Yeah, great questions. Wow, cutting to the bone. Yeah, totally. For the first question, yes, I felt an extraordinary nervousness and anxiety. Listen, so many people have written about LA and so many people have gotten it right, but there's also a great tradition of people getting it wrong, and they mostly come from the East Coast, and I come from the East Coast. It's just I just knew that if I was going to do this, I just did not want to be that person. And that's why, in part, I read just so many books about LA and spent so much time driving around, but also I really wanted this book to be in other people's voices. That was it's not a history book. It's not a sociological book. If anything, hopefully it's a bit of a nonfiction page turner, just because people were really gracious in sharing their stories with me. And then now, do I want to write about LA or can I write about LA? Yes. One weird thing is that this book is actually kind of small, and I intended it to be that way, but I left so many stories off the page. I kind of feel like I could just refresh this book over and over. So I don't know, maybe that's the future.
LA loves the sequel.
I'll just reboot it. Reboot it, in like a year.
Do you have intellectual content or property that I can license?
No, it's called Everything Now Ragnarok. It's a different version. You didn't see it coming. I'm actually, yeah. So anyway.
That actually connects to the last question that was emailed to us, which is asking if you had to cut any particular stories or darlings from the book. I don't know if you want to spoil Everything Now Ragnarok, but if you could give us a little taste of anything that we missed out on.
Yeah, sure. Great. So there was, here's one. The answer is yes. There's quite a few. They fell either more frequently, I just didn't find a spot for a certain person or story or piece of research that I had done. It just didn't work in the book in the end, because the book was very much like I was taking pieces, printing them out, shuffling them, seeing which themes connected, etc. More rarely, someone would back out. Someone who I actually have to be very careful right now, but let's just say someone who was a full willing participant in the book and shared a lot of their life with me, and then wound up on the front page of the newspaper for really bad things about 6 months before we were closing down the editing process. That person is not in the book. Another example would be I spent a long afternoon interviewing a person and this person's family about one topic, and we had a great interview, and it was going to be so good for the book. It tied up to a bunch of different things. I'm sorry for being vague. I have to protect this person's. But it was halfway through the interview, or 2/3 of the interview, that suddenly they started revealing to me that they were actually in witness protection for something else, and that something else stemmed from what I was there to interview them for. And I was the first person that they were revealing that they were in witness protection. But because of that, it also now needed to say that I couldn't write anything about them. So that was a revelation. Yeah, there we go.
Amazing. All right. So a couple of kind people in the chat have mentioned that the Hector Tobar book is the Barbarian Nurseries.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. I felt so guilty like going off to Google something, but it's a wonderful book. It's terrific. It's got a great story. It's a page turner, but it also says so much about different cultures sort of clashing together. I love that book.
Awesome. And you can rest easy tonight because that mystery was solved. So that's just about it for tonight, everyone. I want to give an enormous thank you to our speakers, Rosecrans Baldwin and Jeff Weiss. Thank you so much both for sharing your time and your stories with us tonight. Before we log off, I am once again telling you that you can get a copy of Everything Now with a signed book plate at Chevalier's Books at the link provided in the chat box right now. And then one last time, thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Rosecrans. Do either of you have any last words for us before we say goodbye?
Buy Everything Now by Rosecrans Baldwin. And donate to the land when we have a Kickstarter. Thelandmag.com. And we'll have print copies in the fall.
I would say too, if you like the Grateful Dead and you like Los Angeles, the Land Mag has terrific merchandise that smashes the two artworks together. The Land Mag, thank you, Chevaliers. Thank you, the wonderful Jeff Weiss, who has a terrific book about Britney Spears that is in the works right now, and he's not going to talk about because it's in the works. But I'm just going to shout it out right now. And just thank you, everyone, for listening, and I really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you both. Thank you, everyone. Have a great rest of your Monday evening. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.